The designer handbags glittered under the fluorescent lights as my classmates whispered and pointed at my thrift store backpack, but they had no idea that by the end of senior year, I'd be the one walking away with a full ride to Harvard while they scrambled for community college acceptance letters. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya Johnson, and if you had told me 4 years ago that I'd be standing here today, wearing a cap and gown with Harvard University emblazoned across the chest, I would have laughed through my tears. You see, my story doesn't begin with privilege or connections or trust funds. It begins in a small apartment in Oakland, California, where my mama worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and where every piece of clothing I owned came with someone else's memories stitched into the seams. I was 17 when this story really began, though the seeds were planted much earlier. Picture this: Roosevelt High School, a sprawling concrete building in the heart of Oakland where dreams went to die and stereotypes lived forever. The hallways echoed with the sound of designer sneakers against polished floors, Gucci belts catching the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows, and conversations about weekend trips to Napa Valley and family vacations in Europe. And then there was me. I walked those same hallways with my head held high, carrying a faded blue backpack I'd found at Goodwill for $3.50. My jeans came from the same place along with most of my sweaters, my shoes when mama could afford new ones, and sometimes even my school supplies. But what those kids didn't know, what they couldn't see beneath the surface of my secondhand clothes, was that I carried something far more valuable than any designer label. An unshakable belief that education was my ticket out of poverty, and a mind sharp enough to cut through any barrier they tried to put in my way. My mama, God bless her soul, had been cleaning offices downtown since I was 8 years old. She'd leave our apartment at 4 in the morning, take 2 buses across the city, and spend her days emptying trash cans and scrubbing floors in buildings where people like us were invisible. Then she'd rush home, change into her uniform for her second job at the local diner, and serve coffee and pie to customers who barely looked up from their phones long enough to say thank you. But mama never complained. Not once. Instead, she'd sit with me at our tiny kitchen table every night, helping me with homework under the dim glow of our single overhead light, reminding me that knowledge was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me. "Baby girl," she'd say, her voice soft but firm as she traced her finger along the pages of my textbooks, "these books are your wings. Don't let anybody clip them." Those words became my anthem, my prayer, my battle cry. Because even at 17, I knew I was fighting a war that started long before I was born, a war against expectations, against assumptions, against a system that looked at the color of my skin and the zip code on my address and decided my future before I even had a chance to dream it myself. Roosevelt High was a microcosm of America in so many ways. The wealthy kids, mostly white, with a sprinkling of affluent Asian and Latino families, clustered together like diamonds in a jewelry store display case, all sparkle and brilliance and untouchable beauty. They drove BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes to school, wore clothes that cost more than my mama made in a month, and talked about their futures like they were reading from a script that had already been written for them. Prestigious universities, family businesses, trust funds that would carry them through life like a golden parachute. The rest of us, the black kids, the Latino kids, the poor white kids from the wrong side of the tracks, the refugees and immigrants still learning English, we existed in the margins of their world. We were the background characters in their stories, the extras in their movies, the ones who served their food and cleaned their houses and disappeared into the shadows when the spotlight moved on. But I refused to accept that role. From the very first day of senior year, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided that if I was going to be different, if I was going to stand out, it wouldn't be because I was trying to blend in or hide who I was. It would be because I was going to be so undeniably brilliant, so unshakably confident, so absolutely excellent that they'd have no choice but to see me. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of intensity that bordered on obsession. While my classmates were posting Instagram stories from house parties and weekend shopping trips, I was in the library surrounded by towers of books, my thrift store notebook filled with equations and essays and dreams written in blue ink. I stayed after school for tutoring sessions, joined every academic club that would have me, and volunteered for extra credit assignments that most students wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. My grades were perfect, not almost perfect, not pretty good, but absolutely, unequivocally perfect. I had a 4.0 GPA, I was ranked first in my class of 847 students, and I had test scores that made guidance counselors do double takes. But none of that mattered to my classmates because when they looked at me, they didn't see a scholar or a leader or a future Harvard student. They saw a poor black girl in thrift store clothes who didn't belong in their world. The whispers started small like they always do. Hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by, sideways glances and barely contained snickers, comments made just loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough for them to deny if confronted. "Look at her backpack," I heard Ashley Martinez whisper to her friend during lunch one day. Ashley was the kind of girl who seemed to have been born with everything handed to her on a silver platter. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect family, perfect life. Her father was a tech executive, her mother was a real estate agent who sold million-dollar homes, and Ashley herself carried a Louis Vuitton bag that probably cost more than my mama's monthly salary. "I know, right?" her friend Madison replied, not even bothering to lower her voice. "It's like she got it from a homeless shelter or something." I kept walking, my head high, my spine straight, but their words followed me like smoke, seeping into my clothes and my hair and my consciousness until I could taste the bitterness on my tongue. It wasn't just the backpack, of course. It was everything. It was the way I wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation throughout the winter because they were the only ones I owned. It was the way I brought lunch from home in a brown paper bag while they ordered sushi and salads from the expensive cafe across the street. It was the way I walked to school every morning while they pulled up in cars that cost more than most people's houses. But most of all, it was the way they looked at me, like I was an intruder in their space, a glitch in their perfect matrix, a reminder of a world they'd rather pretend didn't exist. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in October, during what should have been one of the most exciting times of my high school career. College application season was in full swing, and guidance counselors were scheduling meetings with seniors to discuss their post-graduation plans. I had been looking forward to my meeting with Mrs. Davidson, our head guidance counselor, for weeks. I had prepared a folder with all my transcripts, my test scores, my list of extracurricular activities, and my preliminary college application essays. I had researched scholarship opportunities until my eyes burned from staring at the computer screen, and I had crafted a timeline for applications that would make a military strategist proud. I knocked on Mrs. Davidson's office door at exactly 2:15 p.m., just as we had scheduled. "Come in," she called, and I stepped into her office with my shoulders back and my confidence radiating from every pore. Mrs. Davidson was a middle-aged white woman who had been working at Roosevelt High for almost 20 years. She had salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses that made her look perpetually stern, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her office walls were covered with college pennants and motivational posters, but the overall effect was more institutional than inspiring. "Maya," she said, barely looking up from the papers on her desk. "Have a seat." I sat down in the chair across from her desk and placed my folder of documents neatly in front of me, my hands folded in my lap, my posture perfect. "So," Mrs. Davidson said, finally looking at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read, "let's talk about your plans after graduation." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my voice steady and confident. "I'm planning to apply to several top-tier universities. Harvard is my first choice, but I'm also looking at Stanford, Yale, Princeton, and MIT. I've researched their programs extensively, and I believe my academic record and test scores make me a competitive candidate." Mrs. Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something that looked like amusement flickering across her features. "Maya," she said, her voice taking on a tone that was supposed to sound gentle but came across as condescending. "I think we need to have a realistic conversation about your options." The word realistic hit me like a slap across the face, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davidson, but I'm not sure what you mean. My grades are—" "Your grades are excellent," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Nobody's questioning your academic ability. But Maya, you have to understand that colleges like Harvard and Stanford, they're looking for a certain type of student." "What type is that?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly where this conversation was heading. Mrs. Davidson leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment, her gaze taking in my thrift store sweater, my discount store shoes, my second-hand everything. "Students from families with resources," she said carefully. "Students who can contribute to the alumni network, whose parents have connections in various industries, who can afford to participate in expensive extracurricular activities and volunteer abroad and do the kinds of things that make applications stand out." I felt my jaw clench, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Mrs. Davidson, with all due respect, I believe you might be mistaken about what these universities are actually looking for. Harvard, for instance, has need-blind admissions and generous financial aid programs specifically designed to help students from low-income backgrounds. In fact, families earning less than $75,000 per year pay nothing for tuition, room, and board." She blinked, clearly surprised that I had done my research so thoroughly. "That may be true," she said, "but the competition is incredibly fierce. Maya, I want you to succeed, which is why I'm encouraging you to consider more appropriate options. Such as, well, Oakland Community College has an excellent program, and it's very affordable. You could complete your general education requirements there and then transfer to a Cal State school. You see, Berkeley might even be possible if you work hard and prove yourself. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. This woman, whose job it was to help students reach their full potential, was essentially telling me to lower my expectations and settle for less than what I knew I could achieve. Mrs. Davidson, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest, I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be underestimating my qualifications. I have a 4.0 GPA, I scored 1580 on the SAT, I've taken 12 AP classes, I'm the president of the debate team, the editor of the school newspaper, and I've completed over 500 hours of community service. I speak 3 languages fluently, I've won regional competitions in mathematics and science, and I've been published in academic journals. I think Harvard would be lucky to have me. Mrs. Davidson's expression hardened, and I saw something ugly flash in her eyes. Maya, she said, her voice sharp now, I understand that you're ambitious, but ambition without realism is just fantasy. Students like you? Well, let's just say that the Ivy League isn't really designed for students like you. Students like me. The words hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, and I felt something inside me break and reform into something stronger, something angrier, something more determined than ever before. Students like me, I repeated slowly. You mean black students? Poor students? Students whose parents didn't go to college? Mrs. Davidson's face flushed and she began to backtrack frantically. That's not what I meant at all, she said. I simply think it's important to be realistic about. About what? I interrupted, standing up from my chair. About the fact that someone who looks like me doesn't belong at Harvard? About the fact that because I shop at thrift stores and live in a low-income neighborhood, I should automatically lower my expectations. Maya, please sit down. You're being dramatic. But I didn't sit down. Instead, I picked up my folder of documents and held it against my chest like armor. No, Mrs. Davidson, I'm being realistic. Realistically, I'm the smartest student in this school. Realistically, I've worked harder than any of my classmates to get where I am. And realistically, if Harvard doesn't accept me, it won't be because I'm not qualified. It will be because people like you convince students like me that we don't deserve to dream big. I turned toward the door, but Mrs. Davidson's voice stopped me. Maya, if you insist on applying to these schools, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. And frankly, the application fees alone will be a waste of your family's money. I turned back to face her, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized but had never wanted to acknowledge. Pity mixed with contempt, the look of someone who saw me not as a person with unlimited potential, but as a cautionary tale waiting to happen. Mrs. Davidson, I said quietly, my family's money is not your concern. My dreams are not your concern. Your job is to help me achieve my goals, not to limit them based on your own prejudices and assumptions. I walked out of that office with my head held high, but as soon as I reached the hallway, the full weight of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. I ducked into the nearest bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and let the tears fall silently down my cheeks. This was supposed to be my safe space. School was supposed to be where merit mattered more than money, where intelligence trumped inequality, where hard work was rewarded regardless of your zip code or the color of your skin. But sitting in that bathroom stall, surrounded by graffiti and fluorescent lights and the echo of flushing toilets, I realized that school was just another reflection of the world outside, a world where people looked at me and saw limitations instead of possibilities. The whispers in the hallways got worse after that. Somehow, word had gotten out about my college ambitions, and it spread through the school like wildfire. I heard fragments of conversations as I walked to class. Did you hear Maya Johnson thinks she's going to Harvard? Harvard? That's hilarious. I mean, she's smart, but come on. Be realistic. My dad says affirmative action is the only reason kids like her even have a chance. Even with affirmative action, she'll never fit in somewhere like that. Each comment was like a paper cut, small and seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively they left me feeling raw and exposed. I began to dread walking through the hallways and began to shrink into myself in ways that felt foreign and wrong. But the worst was yet to come. The mockery reached its peak during lunch on a Thursday in November. I was sitting alone at my usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich I had made at home and reading a book about constitutional law, when I heard the sound of expensive heels clicking across the linoleum floor. I looked up to see Ashley Martinez approaching my table, flanked by her usual entourage of perfectly coiffed, perfectly dressed, perfectly privileged classmates. Madison Chin was there, along with Brittany Williams, Sophie Turner, and Emma Rodriguez, the unofficial queens of Roosevelt High, the girls who set trends and decided who was cool and who was not. "Hey Maya," Ashley said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We heard about your college plans. That's so ambitious of you." I closed my book and looked up at her, my expression neutral. "Thank you," I said simply. "We were just wondering," Madison chimed in, "how exactly are you planning to afford Harvard? I mean, even with financial aid, there are still expenses, right? Like, what are you going to wear to classes? More thrift store finds." The other girls giggled, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "And what about textbooks?" Sophie added. "I heard Harvard textbooks can cost like $1,000 per semester. Are you going to buy those used too?" "What about social events?" Brittany joined in. "I mean, Harvard has all these exclusive parties and networking events. You'll need proper clothes for those, right? Designer dresses and expensive jewelry and what about spring break?" Emma interrupted. "All the Harvard kids go to Martha's Vineyard or the Hamptons or Europe. Are you going to fit in with your unique sense of style?" They were all laughing now, their voices growing louder and more cruel with each comment. I could feel other students turning to look at us, could sense their excitement at witnessing what was clearly intended to be my public humiliation. But instead of shrinking away, instead of letting their words cut me down to size, I felt something rise up inside me, a flame that had been flickering for months and was now roaring to life. I stood up slowly, my book still in my hand, my lunch forgotten on the table. "You know what?" I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the cafeteria. "You're absolutely right. I'm going to Harvard and I am going to stand out. I'm going to stand out because while you've been spending the last 4 years worrying about your nail appointments and your Instagram followers, I've been building the kind of mind that universities dream of recruiting. I'm going to stand out because I've earned my place through merit, not through my parents' bank account or their alumni connections." The laughter died away and I could see uncertainty flickering in their eyes. "And you know what else?" I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "In 10 years, when you're living off your trust funds and complaining about how bored you are, I'll be changing the world. I'll be writing laws that protect people like my mother, starting companies that create opportunities for kids like me, and proving every single day that intelligence and determination matter more than designer labels and family connections." Ashley's face had gone red, and I could see her struggling to come up with a response that would regain her social footing. "Well," she said finally, "we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" "Yes," I replied, picking up my backpack and slinging it over my shoulder with pride instead of shame for the first time in months. "We will." I walked away from that table with my head high and my heart pounding, but I also walked away with a new understanding of what I was up against. This wasn't just about getting into college. This was about proving that someone like me, someone who looked like me, someone who came from where I came from, belonged in spaces that had been reserved for people like them for centuries. The weight of that realization was almost crushing. I wasn't just applying to Harvard for myself. I was carrying the dreams and hopes of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to aim high. I was representing every kid who had ever been judged by their clothes instead of their character, every student who had ever been counseled to lower their expectations instead of being supported in reaching their potential. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my college applications spread out in front of me like battle plans. My mama was at work, pulling another double shift, but I could feel her presence in the way she had organized my papers, in the cup of tea she had left for me with a note that said, "You got this, baby girl," in her careful handwriting. I stared at the Harvard application for a long time before I began typing. The essay prompt asked me to describe a challenge I had overcome and how it had shaped my perspective on life. I could have written about growing up in poverty, about watching my mother work herself to exhaustion, about the constant struggle to afford basic necessities while my classmates complained about having to choose between 2 designer bags. But instead, I wrote about dignity. I wrote about what it means to walk through the world with your head held high when everyone around you is trying to convince you to look down. I wrote about the strength it takes to dream big when you're surrounded by people who profit from keeping your dreams small. I wrote about the courage required to bet on yourself when the odds are stacked against you and the house always seems to win. I wrote about my mother, who taught me that pride doesn't come from what you own but from what you accomplish. I wrote about my community, full of people who had been underestimated and overlooked but who continued to build beautiful lives out of determination and hope. I wrote about my own journey, the long road from that little girl who used to practice acceptance speeches in the mirror to the young woman who was now crafting those speeches for real. But most importantly, I wrote about my vision for the future. Not just my own future but the future I wanted to help create. A future where a student's potential wouldn't be limited by their parents' income, where intelligence would be nurtured regardless of zip code, where every child would be encouraged to dream as big as their hearts could hold. I submitted my application at 11:47 p.m. on November 1st, the deadline date. As I hit the submit button, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration wash over me. I had just bet everything on myself, had just declared to the universe that I believed I was worthy of the best opportunities available. Now all I could do was wait. The months between November and March felt like an eternity. Every day I checked my email obsessively, my heart racing every time I saw a message from any university. Rejection letters began arriving in February, thin envelopes and brief emails that all said essentially the same thing. Thank you for your interest, but we regret to inform you. Stanford rejected me. So did Yale. Princeton sent a waitlist notification that felt more like a polite dismissal than genuine consideration. MIT never even acknowledged that I existed. With each rejection I could feel the doubt creeping in. Maybe Mrs. Davidson had been right. Maybe I had been foolish to aim so high, to believe that someone like me could compete with students who had every advantage handed to them on a silver platter. The whispers at school grew louder and more cruel. I heard Maya got rejected from Stanford. I overheard Ashley telling someone at her locker. Shocking, Madison replied sarcastically. Who could have seen that coming? I actually feel kind of bad for her, Sophie added, though her tone suggested she felt anything but sympathy. It's embarrassing to fail so publicly. But I kept going to school, kept holding my head high, kept checking my email every morning with a mixture of hope and dread. Because there was still one school I hadn't heard from yet. The one that mattered most. Harvard. March 15th was the day Harvard released their early admission decisions. I woke up that morning with my stomach in knots, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone to check my email. Nothing. I went through my entire morning routine, shower, breakfast, getting dressed for school, in a fog of anxiety. Maybe no news was good news. Maybe they were still deliberating. Maybe. My phone buzzed with a notification. Email from admissions@harvard.edu. I stared at the notification for a full minute, afraid to open it. This was it. This was the moment that would determine not just my future, but whether everything I had believed about myself, everything I had worked for, everything I had endured, had been worth it. I opened the email. Dear Maya, congratulations. It is with great pleasure that we inform you of your acceptance to Harvard University's class of 2029. Your academic achievements, personal qualities, and potential for contribution to the Harvard community have impressed our admissions committee tremendously. I read the first sentence 3 times before the words actually sank in. I had done it. I had actually done it. I was going to Harvard. I screamed so loud that our upstairs neighbor banged on the ceiling, but I didn't care. I called my mama, who was at work, and she started crying so hard that her supervisor had to take the phone to make sure she was okay. I called my grandmother, who immediately started planning a celebration dinner. I called my best friend Jasmine, who had moved to Los Angeles the year before but who had been cheering me on from afar. But even in that moment of pure joy, I knew that the real victory wouldn't come until I walked into school that day and proved to everyone who had doubted me that they had been wrong. I printed out the acceptance letter and folded it carefully, placing it in the front pocket of my thrift store backpack. Then I got dressed in my favorite second-hand sweater, the navy blue one with a small hole near the left elbow that I had carefully mended with matching thread, and walked to school with a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in months. The first person I saw when I walked through the front doors was Mrs. Davidson. She was standing near the main office talking to another guidance counselor when she spotted me walking down the hallway. Something in my expression must have caught her attention, because she excused herself from her conversation and approached me. Maya, she said, her voice cautious. You look different today. Happy. I am happy, Mrs. Davidson, I replied, unable to keep the smile off my face. Did you hear from any of the schools you applied to? I reached into my backpack and pulled out the letter, unfolding it slowly and holding it out for her to see. I heard from Harvard, I said simply. Mrs. Davidson's eyes widened as she read the first few lines of the letter. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, something that might have been embarrassment, and finally grudging respect. Maya, she said quietly, this is incredible. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, taking the letter back and folding it carefully. I guess sometimes it pays to be unrealistic. I walked away before she could respond, but I could feel her watching me as I continued down the hallway toward my first period class. Word spread through the school faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew that Maya Johnson, the girl with the thrift store clothes and the second-hand dreams, had been accepted to Harvard University. The reactions were mixed. Some students, particularly those from backgrounds similar to mine, approached me with genuine excitement and congratulation. They saw my acceptance as proof that it was possible, that someone like us could break through barriers that had seemed insurmountable. But others, particularly Ashley and her crew, seemed personally offended by my success. I was eating lunch at my usual table, trying to concentrate on my constitutional law book while fielding congratulations from classmates, when Ashley appeared beside my table. But this time she was alone, and the fake sweetness in her voice had been replaced by something sharper and more bitter. "So," she said, sliding into the chair across from me without being invited. "Harvard, huh?" "Harvard," I confirmed, not looking up from my book. "I suppose you think you're pretty special now." I closed my book and looked at her directly. "Ashley, I thought I was pretty special before I got into Harvard." The acceptance letter just confirmed what I already knew about myself. Her face flushed red, and I could see her struggling with something she wanted to say but wasn't quite brave enough to voice. "You know this doesn't change anything, right?" she finally said. "You're still the same girl who shops at Goodwill and brings lunch in a brown paper bag. Designer clothes don't come with acceptance letters." I smiled at her, a real smile this time, not the polite mask I had been wearing for months. "You're absolutely right," I said. "I'm the same girl. I'm the same girl who values substance over style, who understands that true worth comes from what you contribute to the world, not what you can afford to buy from it. I'm the same girl who has learned more about resilience and determination from shopping at thrift stores than you'll ever learn from having everything handed to you." I stood up, gathering my books and my brown paper bag lunch. "The difference is," I continued, "now I have a Harvard education to add to all the other things that make me who I am. And in 4 years, when I graduate from one of the most prestigious universities in the world, I'll still be the same girl who remembers where she came from and who she's fighting for." Ashley stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before: uncertainty. For the first time in her life, someone she had dismissed and belittled had achieved something she couldn't buy, couldn't inherit, and couldn't fake. "Whatever," she said finally, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. I walked away from that conversation feeling lighter than air. The girl who had spent months feeling like an outsider, like she didn't belong, had finally found her place. Not because Harvard had validated her worth, she had always been worthy, but because she had proven to herself that her dreams were not too big, her hopes were not too high, and her ambitions were not unrealistic. Graduation day arrived in June like a gift wrapped in sunshine and possibility. I stood in the wings of the auditorium stage, wearing my cap and gown, waiting for my name to be called as valedictorian of Roosevelt High School's class of 2025. The auditorium was packed with families, friends, and faculty members, all gathered to celebrate the achievements of 847 graduating seniors. I could see my mama in the third row, wearing the dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, her first new dress in 3 years. She was crying already, and I hadn't even given my speech yet. Next to her sat my grandmother, my Aunt Rosa, my cousin Marcus, and several family friends who had watched me grow up and had been part of my support system throughout this journey. They were all beaming with pride, and seeing their faces gave me the strength I needed for what I was about to do. Principal Johnson stepped up to the microphone to introduce me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "it is my honor to present our valedictorian, a young woman who has exemplified excellence in academics, leadership, and character throughout her 4 years at Roosevelt High School. She will be attending Harvard University in the fall on a full scholarship. Please welcome Maya Johnson." The applause was thunderous as I walked across the stage to the podium. I looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly, some neutral, some still skeptical, and felt a calm settle over me that I had never experienced before. "Fellow graduates, families, faculty, and friends," I began, my voice steady and clear. 4 years ago, I walked through the doors of Roosevelt High School as a scared 14-year-old girl who wasn't sure where she belonged. I was wearing a sweater from Goodwill, carrying a backpack that had seen better days, and holding on to dreams that some people told me were too big for someone like me. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience, making eye contact with Mrs. Davidson, with Ashley and her friends, with all the people who had underestimated me. Today I stand before you as your valedictorian, as a Harvard-bound scholar, and as living proof that your circumstances don't define your destiny, your choices do. The applause began again, but I held up my hand to continue. "I want to talk to you today about dignity," I said. Not the kind of dignity that comes from designer clothes or expensive cars or family connections, but the kind of dignity that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone else define your worth. I could see heads nodding throughout the audience, particularly among the students and families who looked like me, who had struggled like me, who had been told to dream smaller like me. Dignity is walking into a room with confidence even when your clothes came from a second-hand store. Dignity is pursuing excellence even when others tell you to be realistic. Dignity is believing in yourself even when the world suggests you shouldn't. I looked directly at Ashley, who was sitting in the front section with the other honor students. Some of you in this audience have had every advantage: financial security, family connections, expensive tutoring, and designing everything. And that's wonderful. You are blessed, and I hope you use those blessings to make the world better. I shifted my gaze to include the entire audience. But for those of you who have had to fight for every opportunity, who have had to prove yourselves over and over again, who have been told that your dreams are unrealistic or inappropriate, I want you to know that your struggles have not been in vain. They have made you stronger, more resilient, more determined, and more compassionate than you ever could have been otherwise. The emotion in my voice was genuine now, coming from a place deep in my heart where I had stored up all the pain and doubt and fear of the last 4 years. My mother is sitting in this audience today, I continued, gesturing toward Mama, who was now openly weeping with pride. She has worked 2 jobs for as long as I can remember, cleaning offices and serving food, making sacrifices I'm only now beginning to understand. She never had the opportunity to go to college herself, but she made sure I had every opportunity to pursue my education. I paused to let the emotion settle. Every piece of clothing I've worn to school for the past 4 years came from a thrift store or a discount rack. Every school supply I've used was bought with careful consideration of our family budget. Every meal I've eaten in this cafeteria was packed in a brown paper bag because we couldn't afford the meal plan. I could see some of my classmates shifting uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps remembering their cruel comments and thoughtless jokes. But you know what? I wouldn't change any of it. Because those experiences taught me the value of hard work, the importance of education, and the power of perseverance. They taught me to be grateful for opportunities instead of entitled to them. They taught me to see possibilities where others see limitations. The applause was building again, but I wasn't finished yet. To my fellow students who come from privilege, and I say this with love, not judgment, you have been given much, and much will be expected of you. Use your advantages not to maintain the status quo, but to break down barriers for others. Use your connections not just to advance your own careers, but to create opportunities for people who haven't had your advantages. I looked out at Mrs. Davidson, who was sitting with the other faculty members. To the adults in this room who work in education, remember that your job is not to limit students' dreams based on their backgrounds, but to help them achieve those dreams regardless of the obstacles in their way. Every student deserves to be encouraged to reach their full potential, not counseled to settle for less. I could see Mrs. Davidson wiping tears from her eyes, and I hoped they were tears of understanding rather than just emotion. And to my fellow graduates, I said, my voice rising with passion, remember that success is not about where you start, it's about where you finish. It's not about what you own, it's about what you contribute. It's not about fitting in, it's about standing out for the right reasons. I reached into my robe and pulled out a small piece of paper, the original acceptance letter from Harvard that I had carried with me since March. This letter changed my life, I said, holding it up for everyone to see. But not because Harvard validated my worth. It changed my life because it reminded me that I had always been worthy. It reminded me that dreams backed by hard work and determination are never unrealistic. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. As we leave Roosevelt High School today and head off to our various futures, I challenge each of you to remember where you came from while reaching for where you want to go. I challenge you to lift others up instead of putting them down. I challenge you to see potential in everyone, including yourselves. I paused for one final moment, looking out at the faces of my classmates, my teachers, my family, and my community. They laughed at my thrift store clothes, I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. They whispered about my second-hand dreams. They told me to be realistic about my limitations. But today I stand before you as proof that the only limitations that matter are the ones we accept for ourselves. I raised my fist in the air, a gesture of triumph and defiance and hope. Class of 2025, I shouted, let's go change the world. The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers and standing ovations that seemed to go on forever. I could see my mama sobbing with pride, my classmates on their feet, even Mrs. Davidson applauding enthusiastically. But the moment that meant the most to me came as I was walking off the stage. Ashley Martinez approached me, her usual entourage nowhere to be seen, her expression humble and sincere. "Maya," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the mean girl who had tormented me, but a teenager who was grappling with her own insecurities and prejudices. "We were all wrong about a lot of things," I replied. "The difference is now we have the chance to do better." She nodded, and I could see genuine respect in her eyes for the first time. "Congratulations on Harvard," she said. "You earned it." "Thank you," I said. "And Ashley? Good luck at USC. I heard you got in. That's a great school." She smiled, a real smile this time, and extended her hand. "Maybe we'll run into each other in the future," she said. "Maybe we will," I agreed, shaking her hand. "And when we do, I hope we'll both be proud of the women we've become." As I write this story now, 6 years later, I'm sitting in my apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, putting the finishing touches on my Harvard Law School thesis on educational equity and civil rights. In a few months, I'll graduate with my JD and begin work at a firm that specializes in fighting for the rights of students from underserved communities. My thrift store backpack sits in the corner of my room, retired but not forgotten. It holds a place of honor in my apartment, a reminder of where I came from and why I do the work I do. My mama still works 2 jobs, but now she also gives talks at local schools about the importance of supporting your children's dreams. She's become something of a local celebrity, known as the woman who raised the girl who went from Goodwill to Harvard. Mrs. Davidson retired 2 years ago, but not before implementing new policies at Roosevelt High that require guidance counselors to encourage students to apply to reach schools and provide support for college application fees for low-income students. She sent me a letter when I was accepted to law school, apologizing again for her initial reaction and thanking me for teaching her to see students' potential rather than their limitations. Ashley Martinez and I have actually stayed in touch. She's working in tech now, and she's made it her mission to increase diversity and inclusion in Silicon Valley. We've laughed about our high school drama, but we've also had serious conversations about the ways that privilege and prejudice shaped our interactions with each other. She's become an unexpected ally in the fight for equity and justice. But the real victory isn't in the degrees on my wall or the job offers in my inbox or the recognition I've received. The real victory is in the letters I get from students across the country who heard my story and decided to dream bigger than anyone told them they could. There's Maria in Phoenix, who applied to MIT despite her counselor's advice to stick to community college. She's now a sophomore studying aerospace engineering. There's Jamal in Detroit, who ignored the whispers about his hand-me-down clothes and focused on his love of literature. He's at Columbia now working on his novel. There's Sarah in rural Alabama, who refused to let her small-town upbringing limit her big-city dreams. She's at Georgetown studying international relations. Each of their stories reminds me that our individual victories are meaningful only when they pave the way for others to succeed. The girl who walked through Roosevelt High's doors in thrift store clothes and second-hand dreams has become a woman who understands that true success isn't about escaping your circumstances. It's about transforming them. It's not about forgetting where you came from. It's about honoring that journey while creating better paths for those who come after you. They laughed at my thrift store clothes, but I showed them the strength of my character. They questioned my second-hand dreams, but I proved that dreams don't lose their power just because they've been carried by others before you. They told me to be realistic about my limitations, but I chose instead to be unrealistic about my possibilities. And in the end, that made all the difference. To every student reading this who has ever been made to feel less than because of what you wear, where you live, or who your parents are, remember that your worth is not determined by your wardrobe or your zip code. It's determined by your character, your effort, and your refusal to accept limitations that others try to place on you. To every adult who works with young people, remember that your words have power. Use that power to build up rather than tear down, to encourage rather than limit, to see potential rather than obstacles. And to everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off, remember that the opinion that matters most is your own. Believe in yourself when no one else does. Bet on yourself when the odds are against you. Dream big when the world tells you to dream small. Because sometimes the girl in thrift store clothes grows up to change the world. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs.